Firstly, a big thank you to MSI for making it possible for Hardware Unboxed to attend Computex 2019. Please check out their latest gaming and creator desktop range powered by Intel Core 9th Gen processors via the link in the description. Also, a thank you to Corsair for their support. Check out their new products again via links below.
Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. We have another casual video today to sort of round out our coverage. We're squeezing this in, I think, between our Q&As that we've done. Some of the Q&A stuff sort of touches on what we want to discuss in this video, but we want to elaborate a bit more on some of the topics. Basically, we want to talk about, well, everything Zen 2 up until this point. We want to talk about from stuff that Tim covered back in, was it December of last year?
I think that's right.
Mm-hmm. So we've been having some interesting conversations and we thought we'd put them all together in this video. So it's going to be a casual format. We're just going to discuss the various things that have come up and have led to, well, where we are now, I suppose. So basically for us, I suppose there was some drama with Zen 2 and leaks and whatnot, and that all started around, I think it was December 7th, I've got a note here, for Tim's News Corner episode, when he suggested that the rumors for, well, Navi and Zen 2 were too good to be true. And there's a whole lot to unpack there, so I guess that's what we're going to do in this video, is get into it. So do you want to start getting into it?
There's so much to cover. So
it's sort of a where do you start thing.
I know, because there were so many different aspects that were touched on in the leak, and sort of we've got confirmation for a lot of that stuff now. So we sort of split this up in our notes into a couple of different sections. So I guess, should we just start with the first one, which is kind of the pricing discussion?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think after the keynote, that was probably the thing that most people were disappointed about. I think, the performance was reasonably impressive, at least going on what AMD showed. The 8-core part matching or slightly beating the 9900K looked good. But then they announced the prices, $329 for the 3700X, $400 or $399 for the 3800X. And people are thinking, well, that's more expensive than the Ryzen 7 last gen series by a little bit. And obviously it's much more expensive than what we saw in the leaks.
Yes.
But to me, I don't think those complaints are too valid, because it still seems to me, if the performance claims that AMD, if they're right, that those chips are still going to be really good value, especially compared to the 9900K, which retails still for over $500 US. I think that's right. Did we check that on Newegg? The 9900K. It's over $500
yes.
isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the price has been moving around a little bit, but yeah, it's more expensive than the 12-core part. That much I can assure you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think the pricing will have disappointed people because they were expecting, especially for the Ryzen 5 parts, the 6-core part, but the leak was ridiculously low for that. Would have been nice, but it seemed, as we said, too good to be true. So we were trying to caution viewers not to get too excited about the pricing, because we expected it to be pretty well in line with what we've seen so far from launch prices. And I think it's fair to say it's pretty much what we've seen. The Ryzen 5 2600s, $200 from memory. The 1600 was $220 as the MSRP. Then the 2600 came back in at $200, and now the 3600 is $200. And then we've got the 3600X for $250. So that pricing was always what I imagined it was going to be. There was really no surprises there for me. And I think with what they're offering, it's a great deal. And it's certainly better than anything that you can get elsewhere. So I think that's the key takeaway.
Yeah, I think the thing about the leak that sort of was different to what ended up being the reality was that what ended up being the 6-core Ryzen 5 parts for the 3000 series were leaked as being Ryzen 3 parts, which kind of, Ryzen 3 has come in at a cheaper price point than Ryzen 5. So if those 6-core parts were Ryzen 3, then you'd be expecting them to be a little bit cheaper than, say, the 2600 has been. But they ended up being Ryzen 5 parts, and to me, that still makes a lot of sense. They're still going to be highly capable 6-core CPUs. Like, a 6-core CPU for that premium mid-range zone is something that we weren't really thinking would happen just a few years ago.
That's right.
Intel's top-end processor was still a quad-core, and now AMD is offering, what I assume to be a very good performance 6-core CPU that, should be 8700K or thereabouts level performance, especially when overclocked.
Yep.
So, Yeah, I mean, one of our key points really that we wanted to talk about is that $100 CPU. I think that was leaked, and the $100 CPU being a 6 core is really not something that's ever happened before.
No, I mean, historically, for $100 at launch prices, you don't get a whole lot. There's never been, as far as I can recall, there's never been a $100 Core i3 upon release.
Yeah.
They've always been like, I think the cheaper ones have been like $117 US, around $120 US. For $100, you have to buy a dual-core Pentium processor, now with hyperthreading enabled.
Yeah.
And then from AMD, it's been, well, the best we've ever got really, the Ryzen 3 2200G. Was that $110 US?
I think that was 99 US. Yeah.
As the launch. I can't remember what the launch price was. It definitely sold for around $100.
Yeah.
And again, that's a quad core. So, yeah, I think people were expecting, well, based on the leaks, a ridiculous leap. So a lot more cores, more IPC, better memory support, PCIe 4.0, all this stuff. Yeah, it just was never going to happen. And yeah, AMD would be doing something that we've never seen before with the $100 price bracket.
Yeah, and I think that moves well into the next discussion on the pricing stuff, which was sort of the argument that we heard a lot, not just from, various other creators, but also from our own community about sort of AMD pricing not necessarily to the market conditions to gain money, but more to gain market share. So there's always been this sort of argument, that they're so far behind Intel in terms of market share, and they've got this new 7nm technology. They've got these new CPUs that they can offer for a lot cheaper than Intel CPUs. So why don't they just sell them for ridiculously cheap to gain a whole ton of market share? And to me, it's not really something that's ever made a whole lot of sense to me. Like, don't get me wrong, I get the argument that AMD wants more market share. That's a perfectly valid thing for a company to want. But the primary focus for any company, especially a company that's public like AMD, it has investors, it has stakeholders, there's people that, they need to please with their strategy as a company. Market share isn't really something that tickles the fancy of those investors.
No, it's money.
If it's not paired with money.
Yes.
So if the strategy is we want a lot more market share and we're going to do that while getting money, then investors are going to be perfectly fine with that. But when it comes to selling a CPU that they could sell at $400 and then selling that for, say, $300 or $200, then they're going to gain a similar market share, but they're just not making as much money. And again, it goes even further than that, because the argument was sort of like, they're going to gain a lot more market share by selling these CPUs for cheaper. So if an 8-core CPU is priced at $200, that automatically means more sales. But to me, I always thought if the entire range of Ryzen 3000 CPUs is the best value option in that price category, AMD doesn't really care whether they're selling you an 8-core or a 6-core for $200.
No.
Because they're still getting a $200 sale. So for the customer that has $200 available, if AMD has the best value CPU in that price category, they're getting $200 no matter what. And it's even more advantageous for AMD to sell a cheaper to manufacture CPU at that price point.
Yep.
So for them, the incentive for AMD is actually to sell you a 6-core CPU instead of an 8-core for that price, because it costs less to manufacture and costs less to bin and all that sort of thing. So this only works if AMD has, really good value products in all the price points, because then, if Intel had a really competitive $200 CPU, then maybe AMD would need to, make their 8-core $200 to be competitive at that price point.
Exactly, which is why we've always said it's about the current market conditions.
Yeah.
So, and that probably leads on to a few other arguments that we saw. One of the most upvoted comments, and then the discussion followed on from that, was something, I think you made a comment saying AMD wouldn't halve the prices of their competitor.
Yeah.
And then there was a few arguments saying, they've done that in the past. And a lot of the arguments were the 1800X was priced at half the price of the 6900K. But the 1800X wasn't really, I get in a lot of workloads that competed with the 6900K, but it wasn't a direct competitor to the 6900K for basically platform reasons, and also it just wasn't very consistent. So it was really competing more with the 7700K, which had half as many cores, but for a lot of workloads was a lot faster because of IPC, lower latency, architecture, clock speeds, all that sort of stuff. And so they had to sort of price it somewhere where it made sense. If they had a price it somewhere between the 7700K and the 6900K, no one would have bought it, because you would have either got you're not really in the middle there. You either want a 6900K or you want a 7700K. So AMD read the market there and they priced accordingly. So that's why it appeared to be a great value for certain workloads that used the Ryzen 7 processors really well, but then when it was gaming or anything that was a bit lightly threaded, the 7700K was a much better value product.
I think a similar thing has sort of happened this year. You know, on face value, AMD has undercut Intel's whatever it is. What's their 12-core HEDT processor? I'm not really familiar with those names. But it's like the 70...
the 9920X...
Yeah, something
XE,
like
something like
whatever it is. The 12-core...
Their line is the biggest mess.
So, yeah, the 3900X, the 12-core Ryzen 3000 series parts, obviously priced at $500. The Intel HEDT part, which we don't remember the name of, is priced at over $1,000 US. Mm-hmm. But again, it's AMD's still reading the market conditions there. They're not just looking at that and then taking half the price, because AMD themselves sell a Threadripper CPU that has 12 cores in it for not that much more than, you know, this new CPU that they've released. So they can't suddenly go out and switch from selling a 12-core HEDT CPU for, what is it, like $500 or $600 to suddenly selling it for $900.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make a lot of sense. And as well, Intel's HEDT platform still offers features that the AM4 platform doesn't offer, especially the extra PCIe lanes. Yep. I mean, it's not PCIe 4.0, so there is a difference there, but there are still features that platform provides that you don't get with the consumer desktop line, which is kind of why they're still reading those market conditions and, you know, pricing accordingly with their 12-core part. So It looks impressive, but there's still going to be different use cases for those CPUs.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway from this conversation, or this part of the conversation, is that pricing is always dictated by current market conditions. They're not going to just come in and set some completely different pricing that disrupts their own products that are in the market. Their competitors, they want to be competitive, but they're not going to go crazy with it. And well, going all the way back to late last year, that's why Tim made the comments he did about the pricing appearing to be too good to be true. And that's, well, not only has that turned out to be 100% correct on all levels for all the parts that we've seen so far, but yeah, I think it was a reasonable assessment to make at the time. I know it upset a lot of people, because a lot of people, when you hear something you want to hear and you have your heart set on that, and then someone tempers your expectations and says that's probably not going to happen, I get why we saw a huge amount of dislikes on that video, because we sort of shattered a few dreams there. And Tim also had it on good authority, mind you. So we were going off what we thought made sense, and what we've seen in the past, what we expected AMD to do. And then we had some very close industry sources that told us that pricing was definitely nowhere near what you would see at Computex. And we also were told late last year, I think it was around November time, that we wouldn't actually be seeing any of these processors till Computex, and it was going to be launched around the X570 chipset. So we knew that a long way out. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, again, with the sort of the pricing discussion stuff, you know, again, it is not as good for consumers to have the prices as they are. If they were like the leak, they would obviously be better value for everyone, and everyone would be happy. You buy CPU, it's really cheap, that's great, right? But at the same time, you know, AMD, by pricing it where they have and pricing it to market conditions, but still offering the best value CPU, allows them to make more money. And I've never really understood this sort of complaint about AMD wanting to make more money in these CPUs, especially from AMD fans, because AMD making more money means that they can make their future products better. And if they're selling these products for ridiculously cheap, while that would be awesome for us as a consumer, and, you know, I'm always advocating for selling things as cheaply as they possibly can be, from an AMD business perspective, it really helps them not just develop next generation Ryzen CPUs, but hopefully send some of that research and development money over to their GPU team, which needs a bit of a boost.
I mean, ultimately it makes things cheaper for you anyway, because then we just get into a situation where AMD is giving all their stuff away. They haven't put enough money back into research and development, and we end up with another bulldozer FX range. Intel then does nothing for however long that
Yeah.
happened, it felt like forever. And yeah, the market stagnates and it all becomes unfun. And it's,
Yeah.
So,
And the point about like, wanting AMD to crush Intel, like that's another very popular sort of fan comment that we see a lot. And yeah, sure, if you're an AMD fan, that's something to look out for. But even they don't need to sell a $200 8-core CPU to crush Intel.
No.
All they need to do is make their entire Ryzen 3000 series products the best value on the market in the price points they're selling for. And then you guys, the enthusiasts, will buy them. That will improve their market share. That'll improve, their brand perception, which is still, I think, lagging a little bit behind Intel outside of our market.
Yeah, definitely.
Outside of the enthusiasts. So by enthusiasts buying these parts that are still good value, it helps everything in the AMD ecosystem to improve. So
absolutely.
I'm not disappointed in these prices at all.
No,
I think they're actually quite competitive.
It all seems to be very good to me. Of course, we have to benchmark them and test them out, but I don't think there'll be too many surprises there. But of course, there's a lot of things to explore. I think lastly on pricing, the last thing I would just like to say that we've seen some more recent comments justifying the prices or at least blaming us for the prices, which it's very strange, this one. But people are saying because we said the prices were too good to be true, that AMD took note of that and were like, oh, well, let's charge more, which is bizarre because they're just charging what they have always charged. As I said, like the 1600 was, what did I say? I think it was 220 and then they came down to 200 for the 2600 and we're there again for the 3600. So, and you're getting a slightly better CPU every time. And this time I think we're getting quite a substantially better CPU. So it would be bizarre for them to make the CPU quite a bit better in just about every regard, but then cut the price in half. I don't know. I'm a bit baffled by that one, but all I can tell you is I won't use any harsh language on this one, but it's very silly to suggest that Hardware Unboxed and other similar media outlets have any influence on AMD pricing. I think, do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, while I would love to think that a channel of our size with 350,000 subscribers has, the influence level to influence like a major corporation in this space in terms of their pricing.
Yes.
But from what I understand, it is definitely the investors, the board members, the executives at AMD that are making these decisions based on market conditions and making the most money for their investors, which is ultimately who they're accountable to. So
our influence level's around the 0% mark.
Yeah.
It's around there. So
we might influence your buying decisions, but we're certainly not influencing AMD's internal strategies.
No.
That would be quite something to learn about. So
so
I think that sort of argument's pretty ridiculous, to be honest.
Yeah, we definitely won't be engaging with those sort of comments going forward. I think we've explained that one now. It's all very, very silly. We've sort of touched on the release date and timing stuff a little bit, but there's probably a few more things that we can talk about there.
Yeah, I mean, where do you begin with the timing stuff? I mean,
well, you sort of have to go all the way back to when all this began for us, when you foolishly discussed the information in one of your News Corner episodes.
It's kind of, for us in the industry, we know a lot about AMD's release schedule in terms of when they're planning events for us to attend, when they want us to fly out and stuff. And I made the comment in that initial video about the CES stuff because AMD weren't offering to fly us out to CES. They weren't planning a tech day, and a tech day is AMD's big event where we get in-depth architecture information. We get all the details that we need for the review, and usually that's right before we can get the CPUs in our hands. It'll be like
a week, usually
maybe
before.
A couple of weeks before, maybe a month maximum before
and
we get the CPUs.
These are big global events, so media from all around the world come. Usually for a big thing like this, there's like usually just one location.
Yeah, so we'll have to fly to the US.
Sometimes they break it up and do like a simultaneous thing across a few different regions. But for all these things, it's usually US based. Media from around the world gather in the US, and because it's such a big event and there's so many things to organize, I think about 2 months, it's fair to say, in advance.
Yeah, we would certainly get, usually like a save the date or something, make sure that in this week or whatever, you've got that time off to come attend our tech day. So with the CES stuff, we hadn't heard anything. We'd heard at the time about the Ryzen Mobile stuff, which was announced at CES, the Ryzen Mobile 3000 series. We got that information, I don't know, like a month before it was released or something like that. We're releasing these products, which is fine. So when we heard about that, but we didn't hear about the Ryzen desktop stuff, immediately we knew really that CES was not going to be the launch time for those products.
And then those suspicions were confirmed when industry sources reached out to us and said, please don't do a video on this stuff because it's inaccurate and we're not launching anything at CES.
Yeah, pretty much.
There's going to be no concrete announcements. There may be a teaser. You talked about all of this in your CES video.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And there was confusion at the time over the announcement versus teaser versus release versus whatever. And that language, obviously, I think we've learned a lot about what people sort of think each of those terms means. But at the end of the day, you weren't getting product information at the show, and that didn't eventuate.
For us, the wording's really irrelevant anyway because it turned out exactly as you said.
Yeah.
For us, we were just trying to inform our viewers that, look, I know you guys are excited. We're excited as well, but maybe just put that excitement in check because it's going to be quite a few months before you really hear anything concrete. And it's going to be like a Q3 thing for when you can buy them. And we were seeing the reason you covered it in News Corner was because we were seeing hundreds upon hundreds of comments of people saying, why aren't you guys talking about this? Ryzen 3000 is coming soon. $100 6-core part. That's definitely the one I'm buying. How many people did you see the comment saying that's definitely my next CPU? $100 6-core,
Yeah.
So, that's why we wanted to make that video and just let you guys know that it's not going to play out that way.
It's important for you, I'm sure, for you guys as well to know sort of, at least from what we know about these release schedules, because if you had heard that information in December and you were planning a PC build in the next couple of months and you got this information, the CPUs are coming in January, cool, I'm just going to wait and I'm just going to buy those CPUs because they're just around the corner. It might be disappointing to hear, but I think that it's better for you guys to have that information because then sort of, well, actually, if I'm planning a PC build now, it might not be then. It might be 6 months later, and that could change your purchasing decisions. Sure. And you might go with the CPU now and then choose to upgrade 6 months down the track.
Exactly, and that was one of the reasons why we did one of those budget Ryzen builds around that time to say, well, the prices on those first-gen Ryzen parts are so low now. If you've been holding off for quite some time and you want a really good value CPU, it might just be worth grabbing one of those. I can't even remember the prices now, but the Ryzen 5 1600
it's like mid-$100, isn't it?
It was dirt cheap. I think someone posted a comment on Twitter for I think it might have even been a Ryzen 7 1800X. It was definitely a first gen Ryzen 7 model, so an 8-core 16 part, and they bought it in the US for $130 at a store, brand new, warranty and all. So that's absolute craziness. So, and that comes back to you talking about AMD giving away the processors basically, or making them as cheap as possible. If you are after a cheap processor and excited for one, I mean, a first-gen Ryzen part is still very capable. And if you want a cheap editing rig or whatever, or a cheap encoding machine, rendering machine, get a Ryzen 7 or a cheap gaming system, a Ryzen 5 1600. So,
and again, you still have that upgrade path when the legitimate Zen 2 parts come.
Get yourself a decent quality B450 motherboard. We've been recommending the MSI B450 Tomahawk or the Carbon Pro if you can swing for that. They're both pretty much the best quality B450 boards. Put that on there and it's happy days. So
I mean that's pretty much the timing stuff. We've said before AMD doesn't reveal this information unless there's an imminent tech day. Obviously around the Computex time you've gotten information, so there's an E3 event coming up as well where they've got their live streamed related stuff. So, Zen 2 is launching just around the corner. You can sort of piece together what's happening there. As well with the release date and timing, there were lots of discussion about how, the specs, pricing, release date stuff is all subject to change. I think this is another point that we want to touch on is the sort of subject to change thing. But from what we understand, at least with the release date stuff in particular, this stuff is set a long time ahead. Like
Absolutely.
It's not like they choose 2 months ahead. They're like, oh, we'll release it in 2 months from now. Like they've got this schedule locked in from a long way out, so they can plan, they look at the schedule, they see, well, there's Computex here, there's E3 here, there's CES, are our products going to be ready for CES? They would have known that maybe 6 months ahead of time. They'd be like, no, not ready for then, might be ready for Computex. So then they start planning the logistics around launching then. And, these are very complicated launches for a company like AMD. It's not like they can just flick the switch and release the products onto the market. There's lots of complicated planning processes that require teams of people to execute.
Yep.
So as far as the release stuff, as far as I'm aware, that really isn't subject to change too much outside of a few weeks.
Even pricing really isn't either. I think, did you say this in your news corner
Yeah,
thing? I'm
I
trying to
said-
remember what you said back in December, but
I
you
said
said prices can
basically-
move around a little bit.
Yeah, I said they don't set pricing that far ahead of time because they want to assess the market conditions at the time they release. Which I'm not sure exactly how I worded it, but that is kind of what I meant.
Yeah, and people, I think, thinking back again, this was quite some time ago, but people were challenging that because they said, of course, they know what they have to sell it for. And that's not necessarily what you were saying. You were just saying the actual, so they know what they have to sell it for to make a profit.
Yeah, they know how much the chips are going to cost from however many months you want to say ahead of time. Especially when they start getting their first engineering samples in, they would have known how much is this going to cost? How much is this going to cost at scale? TSMC gives extremely detailed information about their process tech. So AMD would know yields, and their projected yields. So figuring out how much it costs to make the chip is not a big deal, but the question has always been, what are their competitors doing, which is the main thing that is key for what the prices will end up at.
Absolutely.
So,
and we know Intel doesn't really move on pricing. They've not really done
exactly.
that.
So the only thing that would have changed it is a new Intel CPU in that time.
Well, not even necessarily a new one. If they had have decided sales were slowing, they no longer had production shortages. They had a massive inventory of these CPUs, and they wanted to do something they've never really done before, or not often, and that is slash prices quite literally in half. And then AMD might have had to adjust a bit and become as competitive as they possibly could, while still making a reasonable margin.
I think it goes back to you when you were bringing up the Ryzen 5 through the years. You look at how the pricing has been right around that $200 mark for each CPU when it launched. And I think Intel and AMD both pretty much do exactly that. The one exception being the 9900K, which obviously was kind of a Core i9, so it launched in a new product tier, and that kind of occupied a new price point. But typically, generation on generation, instead of companies selling the same CPU for cheaper, they try and sell a better CPU for the same price. So,
and in the CPU market, that can be a 2% IPC improvement.
Yeah, and that's what Intel's delivered for years. So, it's not unusual to see AMD thinking, we're going to make a Ryzen 5 CPU and we're going to sell it for $200. I think that would have been in their plans for quite some time. That might have changed a little bit depending on, say, where Intel's Core i5 CPUs, lined up, the 9th gen stuff. Where did that end up pricing wise? But at the end of the day, they wouldn't be moving on pricing to the extent that we saw it move from the leaks to now. I don't think they would have gone, we think we're going to sell this at $100 and then sell it actually for $200. I think that's probably a bit more unrealistic than reasonable for that. And same with the specs.
Before you jump right in headfirst into the specs, I was going to say, did you want to clear up the TDP thing as well? Because
that's probably good. We'll cover specs and TDP, should we?
Yeah, I think so. Because in Tim's original news corner that started all of this for our involvement in the Zen 2 leaked information, Tim basically, as I said, presented the information that we had from a really good industry source that told us that things like prices and release date in particular, which were the two things I personally was concerned about the most, told us that those were very inaccurate. And then Tim did his own analysis to sort of go, well, I'm going to look into this a bit myself and give my opinion on a few other things, which I think was really interesting. And one of the things he brought up was TDP, which in hindsight, looking back, you probably think that was one of the weaker arguments you made. But it turns out that it probably wasn't a terrible argument after all.
I mean, I'm not going to say that I got that argument right because on reflection, I don't think I really did. I think that I could have done a better job on the maths for that.
Sure.
But, trying to make those videos for News Corner, don't have much time. Not going to excuse myself on that one, though, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff I said, because on reflection, it's kind of, I thought I would be quite wrong on it when I sort of, in the months afterwards, I'm like, maybe you guys are right on this. but at the end of the day, we'll talk about it. So
That's the whole point of this video.
So the one initial comparison I made was the 2700X versus the Ryzen 7 2700X, the existing part, which was 8 cores, versus the new 12-core 3700X, both of them being claimed to be 105 watt parts.
Yep.
So by I mean the 3700X, obviously we now know that to be an 8-core part, but in the leak that was a 12-core part. So I made a big issue about that because I didn't think it was realistic to get an extra 4 cores and a jump from a 3.7 gigahertz base on the 2700X to a 4.3 gigahertz and 4.3 gigahertz boost to a 4.2 gigahertz base and 5 gigahertz boost on 12 cores within the same TDP.
Yep.
I thought that didn't really sound right, even knowing the sort of efficiency claims that TSMC were able to achieve with 7 nanometers. AMD had talked a little bit publicly about those. And I just looked at that and I thought, the gains that you're getting there are not really in line with what we would heard from TSMC and what they were capable of. And you sort of look at, the 2700X does run pretty close to the 105 watt TDP in terms of its actual power consumption. So obviously the TDP tends to be just a marketing term. It doesn't always reflect exactly on what the chips will consume power-wise. But as far as the 2700X is concerned, it's actually quite close. So I thought a lot of those gains, especially getting that amount of clock speed improvement, because as you go up the clock speed, especially at those top-end clock speeds, adding 100 extra megahertz or 200 extra megahertz can significantly increase the power consumption. Whereas adding, say, 100 megahertz or 200 megahertz to, say, 3 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz isn't that significant. So I just looked at that and I thought, personally to me, I didn't really have much insider information on this. I'm like, that didn't really look right to me. And there was a few other things as well. The leak had some parts that were, say, 10 watts different in terms of their TDP. And those parts were clocked significantly differently. Like you were getting 400 or 500 megahertz more for 10 extra watts on the TDP. And I thought, doesn't really look right either. And then the third thing, I'm not sure I mentioned all of this in the video because I've just sort of, as you get messages on your phone. I didn't mention all of these in the video because I didn't want to bore you with all this analysis. But the other thing was that the leak presented new TDPs that AMD hadn't used before. There was a 50 watt for the 6-core, and there was 125 and 135 watt for the 16-core. Obviously, we don't know what the 16-core is going to look like.
We'll talk about that in a minute.
But the 50 watt for the 6-core, I was like, that doesn't really sound right either, because they would just make it a 45 watt part or 35 watt part, which are TDP specs they've actually got. And if we look at the lineup today, they've got 65 watt, 95 watt, and 105 watt, which is exactly the same as the 2000 series. So again, it's kind of that mix between the marketing and the realistic expectations from TSMC's process. And don't get me wrong, 7 nanometers is very impressive, but once you start getting up to that high-end clock speeds above 4 gigahertz, the efficiency drops off quite a lot. And it looks like, from what we're hearing, especially at Computex with overclocking leaks, can these chips do 5 gigahertz and all that sort of thing? It sounds like the specs that we have seen now, the existing 4.5 gigahertz turbos, is kind of maxing out almost TSMC's 7 nanometer process. So yeah, that's the TDP thing. Again, I didn't think I would be right in the end, and I'm sort of not claiming that as a win for myself either. But in the end, it turns out that the chip was clocked a lot lower within the same TDP than what was expected.
I don't know what the people in the comment section would say, but I'd say you were more right than wrong on that one, as it turned out. But it wasn't something you were, that it wasn't the foundation of your argument, let's say. It was something extra, some extra insight you were adding and some extra analysis.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to assessing these leaks, I think it's good to go through the process of how we sort of look at leaks and decide what seems more realistic, especially if we haven't heard a lot from industry sources. And it's just sort of, if there's like one inconsistency in, say you get a whole bunch of information like this leak was, and you're sort of looking through, and if there's like one thing that you think is not quite right, like, the pricing is slightly off or some spec is slightly off, that isn't necessarily going to discount the entire leak, because we understand that especially people that get this information quite early are not necessarily going to have everything 100% spot on. Things are genuinely subject to change to some degree. But then when you sort of look at multiple different components of a leak and things like the pricing don't really seem realistic, the release dates, we were basically told those weren't correct, but also they didn't look correct from what we sort of knew. And then you add in things like these TDPs don't really look right. The clock speeds looked higher than realistic for what we think these CPUs and process technology can do. And it's sort of the culmination of all of those different things can lead us to discount a leak like this as not being real.
Yes.
Whereas there are plenty of leaks that look more realistic and we sort of err on the side more of caution of that turn out to then be accurate. And I think looking back, I think the leaks for the 1660 Ti through to 1650, in contrast to the Ryzen 3000 leaks, a lot of that information was fairly close to what those products ended up being in terms of naming. No one really thought, 1660, that sounds a bit strange. Turns out they use 1660. A lot of the CUDA core counts and all those for those GPUs turn out to be pretty close.
Yep.
Not accurate, but pretty close.
Yep.
Whereas a leak like this, you sort of look at and you're like, again, there's just too many things not adding up. And if there's too many things not adding up, then generally we're not going to side with it. So that's kind of our process internally for how we sort of look at these things. And a lot of the things that we don't think are real or don't think are based in in a real leak, we just don't cover because we don't think it's interesting. We're not a leak channel. We don't want to put information out there that we think is not going to be close enough to the real products.
Yep, sure.
But because we got so many comments about this one particular leak, we're like, I guess we got to cover this, and we did.
Yeah, Tim foolishly talked about it and upset a few people. But anyway, that happens. Excuse me.
I reckon you can take this one. I've talked a lot about the specs.
I guess the next thing of, I suppose we should just move into the 16-core part because that's what everyone's been talking about. And of course, this was in the leak stuff as well, the rumors. It's all everyone seems to talk about is an AM4 16-core part. And we've talked about it in our Q&A series. Probably part 1 went out yesterday, so we touched on it there a little bit. We don't have, I suppose, too much more to say elaborate on what we've already said. But I guess I'll just quickly recap that. So, and it's interesting, I suppose, since then we've spoken to a lot of people, other media, some big names in the YouTube space and tech sites. And it's interesting because they all pretty much, I haven't actually heard anyone agree with our take on things. So probably, I don't know what that means for us. But anyway, as we've said, it's just a guess. It's nothing more than that. We have honestly no idea when a 16-core part will be coming. But Tim and I have had quite a few lengthy discussions about this.
And again, to just interrupt here a little bit, I think as well, it doesn't sound like many other people really have concrete information on this stuff. Everyone's doing a guess.
Yes, everyone. That's a good thing to add, though. Everyone I've spoken to who's having a guess has guessed the complete opposite thing to Tim and myself. So again, I don't know. I don't know what that means for us.
Yeah.
But so we're pretty confident that you won't see a 16-core AM4 part this year.
Pretty confident. Okay. I mean, I think it's more likely.
I was going to follow up by saying, having said that, they could quite easily release one a week or two after they release all the other parts. Again, we have absolutely no idea, and I'll explain our thought process and why we think they won't release it till next year, possibly the Ryzen 4000 series, which I've been calling Zen 2 Plus, but it's really Zen 3, but it's a 7nm plus deal. Anyway, everyone seems to think it'll come like a month or two after the release we see next month, the July release. And we think that won't happen. And I suppose I'll get into those reasons now. So one of the reasons is we just don't see the need for AMD to do it. I think that's probably the biggest reason.
Yeah. Again, going back to the market conditions.
That's right. There's really no reason for them to push out a 16-core mainstream part when they don't have to. Everyone's excited for the 12-core part. It seems like that's going to give the 9900K a really hard time. Probably going to be a much better value buy than the 9900K, especially if you're doing, again, a lot of core-heavy workloads, rendering and coding, that sort of stuff. I think for gaming, they're probably going to be so close that it's not really going to matter. But again, we'll know more about that soon. So I think they'll keep that in their back pocket. I know I would. I would keep that in my back pocket for Ryzen 4000 because we know next year that next step will be coming. and we're not expecting any huge IPC changes there or any major changes really. It'll be sort of a Zen Plus type deal. So having a 16-core part to offer them would make that release really exciting. So to us, that makes sense. And a lot of people have been saying, but there's 16-core parts on the showroom floor, so clearly the 16-core part's coming like straight away. And our thought process there is, well, we know the 16-core part exists. It clearly exists. They have to make a 16-core part to make a 12-core part, assuming that they're not using defective dies and whatnot. But there'll be plenty of 12-core parts that are fully working 16-core parts with 2 of the cores in each of the chiplets disabled. So I think the 16-core parts that we're hearing a lot about and seeing and people are overclocking, it's just obvious that the motherboard vendors have those so they can validate their motherboards or design their motherboards with the 16-core part in mind, because it's clearly coming at some point. We just don't know when. So if there's a CPU we know that's coming, it makes sense to design the boards, the X570 boards now with that chip in mind, because there's going to be overclocking and whatnot. So they want to make sure that their boards can slot in the 16-core part and overclock the hell out of it. So, and it's kind of like a Threadripper 2990WX situation. We had to see a whole refresh of X399 motherboards, or at least flagship boards, to support that chip to its full capabilities, overclock it and whatnot. But if when the X399 chipset came out, AMD sort of said, well, we're going to have like these 300, 400 watt parts, so maybe make sure the VRM can handle that with ease. There wouldn't have been a need to refresh the boards.
Yeah.
So I think that's... have I covered everything there? Well, is there anything else that we've missed?
Yeah, I think, earlier today we were sort of putting it into almost like 2 columns and sort of seeing, which of these columns makes more sense.
Sure,
Is it,
yep.
So column 1 would be release it now or relatively soon. And you sort of think, what would make sense from AMD's perspective in terms of, doing that release now as opposed to later? And you think of, well, first of all, they have the 16-core part available to them. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that would allow them to do it now. Mm-hmm. And then, they want to impress people, or they could, there's interest in it, so it would sell. Motherboards are designed for this chip already, so they could release it now. Those are sort of the things in the first column. Mm-hmm. And you think, what are the reasons that would make sense to release it later? And it's all the things that you've just been talking about. Things like, well, we might not be expecting too much IPC or clock speed gains with Ryzen 4000, so by having another higher core count part available for that line, it suddenly adds interest and it makes that line exciting and could generate more sales than they would otherwise have gotten next year for their CPUs. That's one of them. The other one is there's not too much pressure from Intel in terms of their CPUs on the mainstream desktop line, so there's really not going to be a part that's going to compete with the 16-core from Intel, at least soon. We don't expect.
Yeah.
So that's one of them. The other one is, they've still got to release a 3rd generation of Threadripper platform. So if they had released the 16-core part now and then attempted to release a 16-core Threadripper part afterwards, then that 16-core part probably isn't going to get too many sales, because a lot of the interest will just be in the AM4 platform. Whereas by doing it the other way around and releasing Threadripper first, they could perhaps get some sales for that 16-core part, before they can release the 16-core AM4 parts. That's another thing that makes a lot of sense there.
There's, to a lesser degree, there's the naming.
The naming's also
because they would
potentially an
pretty
issue.
much have to make it like, well, a Ryzen 11 part.
I don't know.
It's going to start getting a bit out of control. Whereas they could call, if they wanted to stick with Ryzen 9, I know there's the whole core count difference thing, but it could be, the Ryzen 9 4900X for the next, for later next year.
I know it's not a particularly great argument, because they could very easily have a 3920X, a 3950X.
Well, we're not really trying to argue either way. We're just saying what we think might happen. So again, this is all just pure guesswork, and it's just what we think will happen.
I was just going to say, I know that argument isn't particularly great, but at the same time, I would be leaning more towards them releasing a 16-core part this year if they hadn't called the 12-core the 3900X.
If they'd left an obvious naming slot for it.
If they'd called the 3900X was actually the 3800X, then they would have that perfect slot right there that would sort of be, you'd be teased towards. You'd be like, oh, look, 3900X is right there for them to use for the 16-core part. But they released the 12-core with that name, which, to be honest, did surprise me at the launch. I wasn't expecting that part to be called that. So to me, that was kind of an indication. I wouldn't want to read into it too much, but companies do plan out these naming schemes quite far in advance, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Threadripper line was actually the lineup that used 3920X, 3950X, 3990X, and those were the 16, 24, and 32 core part Threadripper parts.
Yeah.
I mean, again, just a guess, but so that makes sense to me.
This is what we're guessing at the moment. So the stuff we spoke of earlier, that's really a recap of what was said previously and what we've ended up with and sort of what we said initially there. And it's the same thing with the 16-core part. So a lot of people took Tim's 16-core at 5 gigahertz or whatever the thumbnail was. I honestly can't recall.
Yeah,
but it said...
It's a good thumbnail. Good job.
You did a great job, Tim. It says too good to be true at the bottom under that. And I think a lot of people just took it as we're saying that a 16-core AM4 processor is simply too good to be true. But it was much more than that. So Tim was never once in that video said that there won't be a 16-core processor or even questioned the existence of a 16-core processor.
I went back and watched the video just before we were going to film this, and I actually said that a lot of the naming and core count stuff seemed pretty reasonable to me. That was the most reasonable part of the leak, was the names and the core counts.
That's certainly the easiest thing to guess. Absolutely the easiest thing. The core count and names, not necessarily frequencies and TDPs. That's a bit more tricky.
Yeah,
but
especially after they announced the chiplet design previously with the Epic stuff.
Yep. So yeah, Tim was never saying that a 16-core part was too good to be true or even questioned the existence of one. And yeah, there's obviously going to be one. We're still not saying there won't be, but we're just questioning when it will be released. And we think it'll be next year, but time will tell.
We'd love to be wrong.
Yeah, that would be
great.
Yeah.
We love testing CPUs.
There'd be a lot more stuff to test this year. And that would probably mean as well that for Zen 3, they've got some pretty exciting stuff to hype that launch up as well.
Yeah, and
beyond a few percent IPC increase.
Yeah, and the too good to be true thing was really about everything. It was the 16-core part clocking up to more than 5 gigahertz, and that being priced at, what was it, like $450 or $500 or something?
Let's just say it was the whole thing. It was the entire story for each part. It was, it all seemed too good to be true. Like some of it might have been true. We weren't saying it was all invalid, but just as a package deal, it seemed too good to be true.
Yeah.
So,
and unfortunately, it kind of was.
Well, it was always going to be, and that's unfortunately why we're seeing, I think, there's a lot of talk in our announcement video about it being disappointing, which is...
I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, it's disappointing to see because it's really not like this Zen 2 step from AMD. Again, we haven't tested it, but what we're expecting, what we've heard on the showroom floor from people who have tested it, it's going to be a pretty phenomenal step, and it's going to be really exciting. So nothing to be disappointed about. But
yeah, I think this is kind of why we don't really cover leaks and rumors or like these sort of leaks in general, because imagine if this leak hadn't happened and there was no information or no information of this degree about the Ryzen 3000 line, and then it gets to launch, and I would imagine people would actually be amazed that AMD has a 9900K capable part that not only is 65 watts, but also is costing you $200 less than a 9900K. Like that from that perspective, not knowing anything and coming in, seeing that product, and you come away from it pretty impressed. But when you come from the perspective of being suggested that there might be this, cheap part that's good.
I think as a discussion, it's quite interesting. I know a lot of our viewers, and I know a lot of people who are in the tech scene love discussing this sort of stuff and speculating. They have a lot of fun doing it, and it's quite thought-provoking. And I don't really have anything against that. It's when, and it's hard to do this because people jump to conclusions on all sorts of stuff, but it's when it's sort of presented as being more fact, like, it's I don't know, it's a really tough one to tackle, and it's one of the reasons why we just don't touch it, because We don't like to mislead at all. We try to avoid that best we can. We try to provide you guys with the most accurate information we can. And the only way we can really do that is when we get official information. So we just hold out and wait. And because we hear all kinds of things and we'd love to sort of spill the beans on a few things, but we don't know if that's going to be accurate. And then we mislead you guys. It's not great for our credibility. So we always just hold out and wait. And that's what we sort of did on this one. I mean, Tim discussed the leaks because you guys asked him to, and he gave you his opinion. And anyway, it's played out the way it has. So
yeah,
that's that really.
I mean, yeah.
So at this point, we're just going to move on now. We really just want to test them and see what they're really all about. And that.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that the leak ended up being wrong. You kind of feel for the people that get this information, they publish it, they stand by it, and then it turns out to be incorrect because that can hit people hard. And I think it's a tough game being in the leak and rumor game. We see that there's a lot of sites out there that are focused on this content, and you kind of live and die by these sort of things.
I mean, it is fun and exciting, but at the same time, people do get really caught up in it. So and I'm not talking about the people creating it, the people watching it. Like, they're already making imaginary purchases based on this information. A lot of it is said, we're speculating here, or some of this is based on leaked information, and so therefore we're making this speculation, or take it with a grain of salt, whatever. But people just hear what they want to hear. And a lot of people heard 6-core Zen 2 processor, 12 threads for $100 coming in the next few months.
Yeah, so that's why, when you see these leaks and you're sort of looking into them yourself, maybe we don't comment them on whatever, just keep it in mind as a sort of, potential. But, as always, take everything with a grain of salt and don't believe any rumor that you see ahead of launch as a hard-coded fact.
Yeah.
No matter what the sort of, track record of people are, there's obviously people in the industry that tend to be leaning more on the accurate side. There's people quite clearly say aren't accurate. But no matter who it is, it's just better to think of it as not accurate until you see the information, or take it with a grain of salt. And then especially when it turns out not to be accurate, don't go around blasting people into the next century because they haven't got it right. It's not something I like to see.
Yeah, it's not good, and
it's not good for the community, because it creates it's a sort of a toxic environment for the community to have people blasted for leaks not being correct, and
it goes both ways as well. When you hear a leak and then someone says that either they've got information that contradicts that, or maybe that just doesn't seem like it. That's how it'll go. We'll go, okay, well, I'll take that on board. Don't get very upset. And we did see a lot of people get really upset with what Tim said as well. So that goes both ways. But you have no real reason to get super upset with someone that was just really passionate about this stuff. And anyway, I think that's.
I mean, it's good to see the passion from the community about from these products and getting excited about leaks and stuff, but going around and attacking people is doesn't make it a nice environment to operate in for these people. And sort of we want to have as many people creating good quality content and analysis and discussion as we possibly can, and this sort of thing can discourage people from making content, which I think we don't really want to see, no matter who it is. So
exactly.
So
I think that's well said, and hope everyone's enjoyed this really casual sort of discussion. Tim and I have talked about this stuff a bit.
We talked about this so much at the show. Just
we've probably
every
talked about
day,
it too much. I've just about lost my voice. And it's been a long show, but it's been good. And I hope you guys enjoyed this anyway. So it was a reasonably well structured. It wasn't too bad. We didn't really do any planning. We obviously have no teleprompter, no script. We've got a couple of rough notes on our phone, but Tim, like I said, Tim and I have had this discussion back and forth a bit, and I keep saying to him, this is stuff we should be doing on camera because I think our viewers would be interested. So we've sat down for about an hour now and had this discussion. So
hope you enjoyed this hour-long episode.
It's not something we often do on the channel. I'm really, really itching to get back home. I want to do some preliminary testing. I promised you guys that R5 1600 versus 7700K revisit, see how they're getting on today in the latest applications and games. Plenty of things that Tim wants to do, so we'll get back to the usual sort of schedule stuff soon, and then when the the release date is for all the Zen 2 stuff, and then I think I'm probably not going to sleep for I don't know how long. It's a bit scary to think there's a lot of stuff coming. So
I mean, for people that are interested in like launches and announcements and stuff, it's only a week until E3, which means it's only a week until we get, Navi information from what we understand, until the NVIDIA Super announcement is potentially, or at least what we understand, E3 as well.
There'll almost certainly be some juicy news coming out of E3.
Yeah, and on top of that, we obviously don't cover consoles, but game console is going to be a big thing at E3. So I think as far as E3s go and games, this is one of probably the biggest shows in quite some time in terms of, and it's surprising to see, product announcements in our space in terms of PC enthusiasts being announced around that E3 time, because you kind of think Computex or maybe CES is typical, or Gamescom or one of those shows, but to see all this stuff coming around E3 is just going to make that show a really bumper one this year. So will be a lot of stuff to cover next week, I think. Not that we're attending E3, but for us sitting at home in Australia, there'll be a lot of interest.
We'll cover the news as it comes out and give our opinion on things. So there'll be that. But anyway, I think we should probably wrap this up.
Yep,
so,
I would agree.
Yep.
Need some water.
Yeah, I desperately need some water. It's very humid here, and then it's extremely dry in the hotel, so it makes it quite difficult for talking, especially when you were talking all night. We had a good catch up with some other media last night. So yeah, it's been a really good show for us, and we've had a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed our coverage.
Yep.
And yeah, anyway, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, do all that standard stuff. Thumbs up and all that. And thanks for watching.